There are people who move through the world with quiet, careful steps. People who speak with measured words, who smile softly, who never ask for too much. On the surface, they seem composed, contained, steady, but there is a loneliness inside them, one stitched from the desires they never learned to name, the dreams they buried to keep the peace, the feelings they silenced because someone, somewhere, once told them that wanting was dangerous. Desire for them is not a flame. It is a shadow, always at the edges, never allowed to rise. So they live in a strange tension, wanting but not reaching, feeling but not expressing, longing but refusing to look directly at what they long for. They fear the power of their own hunger. They fear what it might break open. They fear who they might become if they finally said it out loud. And so an invisible loneliness forms not from the absence of others, but from the absence of themselves. This is the story of that loneliness, and of the quiet psychology beneath unspoken desire. There are moments in a person's life that do not announce themselves. No dramatic shift, no sudden scene change, just a soft, unexplainable awareness that something inside has begun to stir. It often starts as restlessness, a gentle discomfort beneath the calm exterior they show to others. Not pain, not quite sadness, more like a quiet echo, repeating a truth they cannot yet translate. They continue with their daily life as if nothing is happening. They wake, they work, they respond kindly when spoken to. They do everything expected of them. But there is a faint hum beneath the routine, a low vibration that wasn't there before. Or perhaps was always there, only now getting harder to ignore. It appears in small, vulnerable moments, in the pause before answering a question, in the heaviness that settles after a conversation ends, in the way their eyes linger on something, a person, a possibility, thought, just a fraction longer than they should. Recognition does not arrive with clarity. It arrives with subtle contradictions. There is a longing, but not the courage to name it. A hunger, but no language for what it feeds on. A desire, but one wrapped in layers of fear and doubt. They realize they want something, but they don't yet know what that something is. So they make quiet bargains with themselves. They say it's just exhaustion. They say it's just stress. They tell themselves it will pass, but it doesn't, because it isn't a fleeting emotion. It's the beginning of self-awareness. The mind whispers long before the mouth ever speaks. They may notice it in the way certain memories rise without being called. Moments when they felt alive once, or nearly alive. Moments when they allowed themselves to imagine something bigger, braver, fuller. Moments that felt like sunlight before they convinced themselves they deserved only shade. These memories do not return to torment them. They return to remind them. There was once a version of themselves that reached without fear. There was once a version that believed wanting was allowed. There was once a version that did not equate desire with danger. But over time, that version became quieter, more disciplined, more obedient to the expectations that shaped them. And now, the buried parts begin to shift against low, tender movements beneath layers of self-protection. Recognition also appears in the body before the mind ever understands. A tightness in the chest, a catch in the breath. A feeling of being almost there, but never fully present. It is the body's way of telling the truth. You are holding something in. You're holding something back. You are keeping something unsaid. People who fear their own desires often become experts at appearing untouched. Experts at managing expression. Experts at hiding longing behind a lifestyle of emotional moderation. But moderation is not the same as peace. And silence is not the same as safety. In quiet rooms, when no one is watching, they feel something shift. Not rebellion, not defiance. Just a soft ache that says, you want more than this. Not more in the material sense, but more in the human sense. More connection, more truth, more permission to exist without shrinking. This recognition is gentle, not loud. It is a candle flame, not a wildfire. It flickers, wavers, tries again. At first, they try to extinguish it. They tell themselves that desire complicates things, that wanting is selfish. That longing is a burden no one is obligated to carry, but the truth is simple. Humans are shaped by what they long for. And when longing is silenced, a person begins to detach from themselves. Recognition is the moment that detachment becomes too heavy to ignore. They may feel it late at night when the world is quiet. They may feel it during ordinary tasks when their mind drifts beyond the surface. They may feel it while observing someone else, someone unafraid to want, unafraid to speak, unafraid to live with open hands instead of closed fists. And in that moment, they realize their fear is not of desire itself, but of what desire reveals about them. Desire shows where they feel empty, where they feel hungry, where they feel unfinished. Desire points to the life they wish they had the courage to live, to the love they wish they could claim, to the boundaries they wish they could set, to the dreams they quietly rehearsed in their mind but never allowed to enter their reality. This recognition is not comfortable. It stretches them. It pulls them toward a truth that feels both beautiful and terrifying, because deep down, they know that naming a desire means confronting the reasons they buried it. So they stand at the edge of their own longing, half feeling, half denying, balancing between familiarity and awakening. And even though they are not ready to speak it, even though they are not ready to want it fully, there is a profound shift. They can no longer pretend they don't feel it. This is where loneliness begins to loosen its grip, not because someone enters their life, but because they begin to re-enter their own. Recognition is the first doorway. The moment a person realizes that their silence has weight, and their unspoken desires have a voice, waiting patiently to be heard. Before someone learns to fear their desires, they learn to fear the reaction to them. It begins quietly in childhood rooms and family kitchens, long before they understood what longing meant. A child asks, reaches, expresses, not out of selfishness, but out of innocence. Every child is born with the instinct to want, to pull toward what feels warm, to step away from what feels cold, to declare in their own simple ways, I like this. I don't like that. I want more. I want different. But not every environment welcomes a child's wanting. Some homes teach the language of restraint early, emotional minimalism, shrinking to avoid upsetting others, becoming easy so love has fewer conditions. In these spaces, desire is not encouraged. It is managed, redirected, corrected. A child who reaches for something and hears "don't ask for that" learns quickly that wanting is unwanted. A child who shows enthusiasm and is met with "calm down" starts believing that energy is excessive. A child who expresses disappointment and is told "be grateful, others have less" begins to associate emotion with guilt. They internalize the lesson, their desires are inconvenient. Some learn it from overwhelmed parents who never had room for their own desires. Some learn it from cultural expectations that reward obedience over authenticity. Some learn it from emotional chaos, where wanting anything more than survival feels dangerous. Children do not rationalize these moments. They absorb them. They begin to modify themselves quietly. They learn to read the emotional weather of the people around them. They sense the tension in the air. They shrink to maintain peace. They speak softly to avoid being corrected. They smile to avoid causing trouble. And in the process, their desire becomes smaller. Not because it disappeared, but because it had nowhere safe to exist. As they grow, they become skilled at asking for less than they want, at pretending they are satisfied with what they are given, at behaving as if wanting more is a betrayal of the people who gave them what they could. This is how self-denial becomes a personality. Later, in adolescence, the pattern deepens. Teenagers often experiment with identity, boundaries, and longing. But someone who learned early to self-shrink enters those years already cautious. They watch others express themselves freely while they remain quiet, studying how desire is received by the world. They may want connection, but fear looking needy. They may want recognition, but fear accusations of arrogance. They may want exploration, but fear stepping outside the invisible lines that once kept them safe. So they learn to hold back, to admire from a distance, to yearn quietly for things they believe are not meant for them. The world becomes a place where desires must be filtered through the question, will this make me too much? Adulthood only reinforces the silence. Workplaces praise the reliable, not the bold. Relationships reward the agreeable, not the expressive. Society honors modesty while secretly chasing ambition. And so they continue to practice emotional discipline. They measure their words. They dilute their needs. They convince themselves that being low maintenance is a virtue rather than a coping mechanism. But beneath all this discipline, the original child still exists, the one who once reached, once asked, once dreamed freely, and that child remembers. Even if consciously forgotten, the emotional body remembers where the silencing began. It remembers the moment wanting became shameful. It remembers the moment needing became burdensome. It remembers the moment the world rewarded them for being less than they actually were. This is why suppressed desire feels so heavy in adulthood. Not because the desire itself is destructive, but because it carries the entire weight of years spent believing it was wrong to want. It is not just the desire that is feared. It is the imagined consequence of expressing it. They fear disappointing someone. They fear ruining the balance. They fear being judged as insatiable or dramatic. They fear being misunderstood. They fear being abandoned. Every fear traces back to the early lesson. Your desires are dangerous. Even if no one said it outright, the environment communicated it. And so, they learn to silence themselves as an act of survival. But here is the quiet truth. What was once survival becomes imprisonment when carried into adulthood unchanged. The rules that once kept them safe now keep them small. The silence that once protected them now isolates them. The self-restraint that once earned affection now blocks intimacy. They do not fear desire because it is powerful. They fear it because they were punished for it. The origin is almost always tender, not malicious. A parent too tired to listen. A culture too rigid to allow expression. A teacher too overwhelmed to see the child behind the behavior. A moment too tense for a young heart to risk want. But the impact is lifelong. This chapter is not about blame. It is about understanding. Because every silenced desire in adulthood was once a whispered desire in childhood. And every adult who fears wanting was once a child who learned that wanting was unsafe. Until these origins are seen, desire will continue to feel like a threat rather than a truth. Understanding where the silence began is the first step towards softening its hold. Desire does not disappear when it is pushed down. It simply relocates into the body, into the subconscious, into the unspoken spaces of a person's life. Psychology has a quiet truth about repression. The mind does not forget what the mouth refuses to say. When someone suppresses desire, the brain performs a delicate, exhausting choreography. It tries to separate the acceptable self from the forbidden self. One is the version they present to the world, steady, restrained, predictable. The other is the version that lives in the shadows, full of longing, curiosity, hunger. This inner split creates a psychological tension, known as cognitive dissonance, the emotional strain of holding two truths at the same time. What I want and what I am allowed to want. To reduce this tension, the mind adapts. It hides desire behind layers of rationalization. It convinces the person that wanting less is noble, that sacrifice is strength, that emotional regulation is the same thing as emotional suppression, but the body keeps score. Unacknowledged desire often returns as physical sensations: a tight chest, a restless stomach, a persistent anxiety that seems to have no clear source, a heaviness that settles in moments of stillness. These sensations are not random. They are the language of a mind trying to speak through the only channel still available. Repressed desire can also surface through intrusive thoughts. Not aggressive or frightening, simply repetitive. A person, a dream, a scenario, an idea, circling quietly in the mind because it has nowhere else to go. The more someone avoids their longing, the more the longing insists on being noticed. This is not obsession. It is unresolved emotional energy seeking release in therapeutic language. Unspoken desire often becomes part of the shadow self, the collection of traits, needs, and impulses a person hides because they believe those parts threaten their belonging. The shadow is not negative. It is simply unacknowledged. What people fear in their own desire is not the desire itself, but the possibility of losing control. The possibility of being judged. The possibility of becoming someone they were taught not to be. So, the psyche develops defenses, subtle, efficient, often invisible. 1. Emotional numbing. When wanting feels unsafe, the mind lowers emotional intensity altogether. A person becomes calmer, quieter, harder to hurt, but also harder to reach. Pleasure, excitement, and connection lose their sharpness. Life becomes muted too. Overthinking desire that cannot be felt openly becomes a mental puzzle. Instead of experiencing it, they analyze it, break it down, question its validity, think until feeling becomes diluted. 3. Self-distraction people immerse themselves in tasks, responsibilities, or caretaking. Anything to avoid the quiet moment where desire might surface. The busier they are, the safer they feel from themselves. For perfectionism, a desireless person does not risk failure. So they perfect performance instead of exploring want. As long as they appear competent, they never have to admit vulnerability. 5. Emotional, over-control-thee, become overly disciplined about their reactions, always composed, always reasonable, always in control. But emotional control is not emotional freedom. It is simply emotional containment, and containment over time becomes loneliness. Because humans are not built to be divided. When a part of the self is exiled, the whole self becomes fragmented. Research on repression shows a consistent pattern. Unexpressed emotions create psychological distance not just from others, but from oneself. A person may wake up one day feeling foreign inside their own life, disconnected from their own preferences, unsure of what they actually enjoy or who they actually are. This disconnection is not emptiness, it is overcrowding. A mind full of stifled desire creates the illusion of emotional flatness. And yet, beneath that stillness, something is pulsing quietly. Psychologists describe desire as an orienting force, a compass that points a person toward meaning, connection, and vitality. When desire is suppressed, the compass spins. Life becomes directionless, even if it appears structured on the surface. The person might achieve things. They might maintain relationships. They might uphold responsibilities. From the outside, they seem fine, stable, functional, reliable. But internally, they live without orientation. Without the inner gravitational pull that desire naturally provides, desire is not simply about obtaining something. It is about knowing oneself. It is about recognizing what brings aliveness, comfort, expansion, peace. When that knowledge is blocked, a person becomes emotionally homeless. This is why suppressed desire often shows up in dreams. The dreaming mind has no filter, no punishment, no societal expectation. In dreams, the forbidden self returns. Freely, boldly, without apology, the dream does what the waking self cannot. It reintegrates what has been exiled. And yet, when morning comes, the person dismisses it again, calling it fantasy, foolishness, imagination. But the dream is not random. It is the psyche insisting. There is a part of you still alive. There's a part of you still wanting. There's a part of you still waiting to be seen. The psychology of suppressed desire is not about pathology. It is about disconnection. The slow, subtle drifting away from one's inner life. The quiet erosion of authenticity. And the cost is not dramatic. It is gradual. A life that feels fine, but never fully lived. A life that looks stable, but feels slightly hollow. A life that others admire, but the person themselves does not entirely inhabit. Understanding this psychology does not eliminate fear, but it brings light to the places where fear once kept everything dim. And with light, the shadow self becomes less threatening, less foreign, less forbidden. This is the beginning of seeing desire not as a danger, but as information, a compass, not a curse. There comes a point when a person feels divided inside, drawn forward by a quiet longing, pulled backward by an older fear. This is the stage where desire becomes a conflict, not because it is dangerous, but because it threatens the emotional structures that once kept them safe. The war is subtle. It is not loud enough for others to notice. But internally, it is constant. One part of them whispers, "You want this. You have always wanted this." Another part replies, "You cannot. You must not. It will cost too much." This is the push and pull that shapes their days. They wake with a sense of yearning for connection, expression, change, truth, yet by afternoon, the protective voice has already convinced them that longing is a risk. They cannot afford fear, insists on the old rules. Stay predictable. Stay acceptable. Stay small, because smallness feels familiar. And familiarity is often mistaken for safety. The conflict intensifies in moments when desire becomes clearer. Perhaps they meet someone who awakens something inside them. Not necessarily romantic, but alive. Someone who mirrors back their hidden depth. Someone who makes them feel seen in a way they had forgotten was possible. Or maybe they discover a passion, a forgotten dream, a possibility that stirs excitement beneath their practiced calm. In these moments, desire rises like a quiet tide. Not overwhelming, just undeniable. But fear rises too. Fear warns of embarrassment. Fear warns of disappointment. Fear warns of being misunderstood, rejected, exposed. The mind creates vivid predictions of everything that could go wrong, every judgment, every outcome, every potential heartbreak. And so, the conflict becomes psychological tug-of-war. The future they quietly long for versus the past that taught them to hide. This struggle often leads to emotional self-sabotage. When the heart moves forward, the mind pulls back. They may distance themselves from situations that trigger desire. They may withdraw from people who make them feel too much. They may bury themselves in responsibility so there is no space left for longing. Some distract themselves with work. Some bury themselves in obligations. Some insist they are too busy when the truth is simpler. They are too scared. What they are truly busy with is managing their own emotional contradictions. People often think avoidance is laziness or indifference. But avoidance is rarely apathy. It is protection. Protection from the unknown. Protection from vulnerability. Protection from the possibility that desire may lead somewhere uncontrollable. Inside this conflict, the person begins to develop emotional habits. They second-guess every feeling. They question the legitimacy of every want. They edit themselves mid-sentence. They pretend they don't care when they care deeply. They retreat even when connection is what they crave. And this retreat is not dramatic. It is quiet. A slow stepping back. A turning inward. A shutting of doors no one else even noticed were open. This is why people who fear their own desires often appear calm on the outside, composed, gentle, careful, while inside. They are navigating storms no one sees. The conflict becomes even more complicated. When desire reveals something about their identity, who they are, who they want to be, what they want to feel, what they wish to experience. Identity-based desire feels the most dangerous because it threatens to rearrange their inner world. If they accept this longing, what else must be reevaluated? What else must be admitted? What else must be confronted? Fear loves stability, even if that stability is painful. Desire loves possibility, even if that possibility is uncertain. So they live between two truths. I want more. I fear more. The inner conflict grows louder in moments of stillness. Late at night, when distractions fade, the desire they pushed aside returns with softness. Not demanding, just present. A quiet companion that refuses to disappear. Their mind argues back. Not now. Not ever. You know what happens when you want too much? The heart replies. You are already carrying the cost of wanting nothing. This is the paradox. Fear tries to save them from pain by creating another kind of pain. a pain without movement, a pain without expression, a pain without possibility. The loneliness of suppressed desire is not about being alone. It is about living beside oneself instead of within oneself. And yet, the conflict is not a sign of failure. It is a sign of awakening. Only someone who longs for something feels the tension of not reaching for it. Only someone who senses their own potential feels the fear of stepping into it. Only someone who is nearing truth feels this level of internal resistance, because resistance appears strongest right before transformation begins. The mind is not fighting desire because desire is wrong. It is fighting desire because desire threatens the version of themselves that survived the past. This inner war is not about choosing desire over fear. It is about understanding that both sides want the same thing: to protect the self. Fear protects through avoidance. Desire protects through expression. They are not enemies. They are two different forms of yearning, one for safety, one for authenticity, and the conflict only hurts because the person has reached the threshold where they can no longer live fully in either direction. This chapter ends in the stillness before change, the moment where internal conflict becomes too loud to ignore, and a turning point quietly waits on the horizon. There comes a moment, often unnoticed, when a person who has spent years fearing their own desires finally begins to sit quietly with them, not to tame them, not to bury them, not to prove they are strong enough to ignore them, just to listen. It is usually a small moment, a pause between two responsibilities, a late-night walk where the streetlights hum like distant memories, a conversation that lingers longer than expected, a breath that doesn't rush to become the next one. And in that stillness, something inside softens, because the truth is simple. It always has been. People do not fear their desires because they are dangerous. They fear them because they are honest. Desire is the one part of a person that refuses to lie. It remembers what the mind tries to forget. It repeats what the heart tries to silence. It carries the stories a person was never allowed to live. And so for years they distance themselves from these truths, the way someone might avoid a mirror when they are afraid of what it will reveal. But mirrors, like desires, do not disappear simply because they are ignored. They wait patiently, quietly, without judgment. When someone begins to return to the desires they buried, it is never with fireworks or revelation. It is more like brushing dust off a long locked drawer. The hinges creak, the lid lifts slowly, and inside, instead of chaos, they find something fragile, something earnest, something that looks less like danger and more like longing. Longing not just for an outcome, but for permission. Permission to want, permission to feel, permission to live a life that doesn't shrink out of fear of wanting too much. As a person starts to recognize their desires without shame, a strange shift happens. They begin to see that their desires were never the enemy. The real struggle was the silence wrapped around them, the secrecy, the fear of being misunderstood, the internal rule that said you are allowed to be many things, but not this. That rule rarely comes from oneself. It comes from childhood expectations, from the quiet weight of cultural morality, from the spoken and unspoken messages absorbed over years. Be good, be quiet, be grateful. Don't disrupt, don't reach too far, don't want what you are not meant to have. But desire does not follow inherited rules. It follows truth. And truth, when acknowledged, does not create chaos. It creates clarity in this final stage of the journey. A person begins to understand that desire is not a roadmap. It is a compass. It doesn't demand action. It doesn't require rebellion. It simply points toward a more honest version of oneself, a version that no longer hides from the fullness of their inner world. They may still choose restraint. They may still choose patience. They may still choose a path that does not match every desire they hold. But now, those choices come from clarity, not fear, and there is a profound freedom in that. A quiet freedom. A freedom without applause or announcement. This freedom shows up in small ways, in the lighter way they walk through a room, in the gentler way they speak to themselves at night, in the subtle comfort they feel in their own skin, in the recognition that desire is not a threat to stability, but a reminder of aliveness. They realize that fear never meant the desire was wrong. Fear only meant the desire mattered. Every longing that once felt forbidden begins to soften into a kind of tenderness. Not a demand, but a truth. The truth that humans are shaped not only by what they have lived, but by what they have silently yearned for. This is the closing chapter, not because the journey ends, but because the struggle changes. The person who once trembled at the thought of wanting now understands something they never considered possible. Desire is not a storm to survive. It is a language to learn, a language that speaks in glimpses, urges, memories, fantasies, and quiet aches. A language that reveals who a person truly is beneath the roles they play. A language that does not force but invites. And with time, that invitation becomes less frightening, less like a risk, more like a homecoming. They begin to notice the spaces inside them that desire once illuminated, spaces that felt dangerous only because they were dark. With light, they become less intimidating. With curiosity, they become understandable. With acceptance, they become integrated. Not all desires will be fulfilled. Not all longings will become reality. Not all fantasies are meant to be lived, but every single one deserves to be acknowledged. And so, the person who feared their desires no longer walks through life carrying the weight of their own rejection. They begin to move with softness, with presence, with the quiet strength that comes from no longer fighting themselves. In the end, the hidden loneliness that once defined them begins to loosen its grip. Not because they have erased their desires, but because they have stopped erasing themselves. There is a moment again, small, quiet, almost invisible, when they realize something extraordinary. They are no longer afraid of the truth inside them. And in that moment, even if nothing in their external world changes, something profound shifts internally. They return to themselves, to the desires that shaped them, to the longings that guided them, to the parts they once feared. This return is the real ending, and also the real beginning. A life lived not in fear of desire, but in gentle conversation with it. There is a moment, often small, it's often unexpected, when the quiet balance between fear and desire begins to shift. It does not happen in a dramatic collapse, not in a crisis, not in a revelation, not in a cinematic turning point. It happens in the softest of places. A conversation, a silence, a memory, a feeling that refuses to stay hidden. Sometimes the shift begins when they encounter someone who mirrors something they have long suppressed. A person who lives with a kind of ease or honesty they were never allowed to have. Someone who speaks openly, feels openly, wants openly, without apology, without fear. In that presence, something inside them stirs. Not envy, recognition, a longing for the self they muted long ago. Other times the turning point emerges through exhaustion, a tiredness, not of the body, but of the inner labor it takes to constantly silence oneself. There comes a day when the emotional cost comes heavier than the fear that once justified it. They realize they are tired of holding their breath, tired of pretending their needs are smaller than they are, tired of living in a way that makes everyone comfortable except themselves. Or the shift happens after a moment of kindness. Someone asks what they truly want, and for the first time, they cannot answer with a rehearsal. Their usual scripts, "I'm fine, it's okay, doesn't matter," suddenly feel too heavy to carry. Their throat tightens. Their eyes soften. Their voice falters, because the truth they have avoided is now too big to stay behind the walls they built. Psychology calls this moment effective breakthrough. When suppressed emotion rises into consciousness and demands to be acknowledged, it feels like something cracking quietly from within. Not breaking apart, but breaking open. There is confusion at first, an unfamiliar intensity, a vulnerability that feels both frightening and relieving. They start noticing the emotional signals they once ignored, the things that make their heart race, Their thoughts wander, their breath deepen, and for a moment, just a moment, they allow themselves to feel it. Not fully, not fearlessly, but honestly. This honesty feels dangerous at first. Their old conditioning rises in panic. Don't go there. Don't want that. Don't ruin everything. But something beneath that panic whispers back. Maybe it's time. This internal opening often reveals truths they have carried for years. They want intimacy. They want recognition. They want freedom. They want honesty. They want to be understood, even in the parts they never speak of. They want to feel alive again. And these wants are not selfish. They are human. The turning point is not the moment desire becomes easy. It is the moment desire becomes undeniable. They begin to see the difference between danger and discomfort, between fear that protects and fear that confines, between the self they presented to be loved and the self longing to exist. They start to question the old rules. Why must wanting be shameful? Why must silence be their default? Why must longing be hidden? Why must they earn the right to feel? These questions do not create immediate answers, but they create space. And space is where truth begins to breathe. They may not act on their desires yet, but they stop pretending the desires aren't there for the first time. They become witnesses to their own inner world, and witnessing changes everything. Because desire, that is, knowledge no longer needs to ambush them in dreams or anxieties. It can rest, even if only slightly, in the light of awareness. The turning point is not an explosion. It is an exhale, a soft release from years of self-containment. A recognition that the self they buried is still alive beneath the layers of fear. This shift often brings grief. Grief for the years spent silent. Grief for the childhood where wanting was unsafe. Grief for the relationships where they hid their truth. Grief for the choices made from fear rather than desire. But this grief is gentle, clarifying. It becomes a bridge between who they were forced to be and who they quietly long to become. Alongside grief comes curiosity, a tender exploration. What if my desires are not dangerous? What if they say something true about me? What if wanting is not a threat, but a guide? These questions mark the beginning of inner freedom, and with that freedom, a new emotional landscape emerges. They notice flashes of boldness, moments where they are more honest than usual, moments where they say, "I want this," even softly, even privately. They may still retreat afterward. They may still worry about consequences. They may still feel fear rise sharply, but the spell of silence is already broken. Once the mind glimpses its own truth, it cannot fully return to blindness. Once desire rises into awareness, it cannot fully disappear again. Something has shifted. Something has begun. Something inside them has chosen to breathe. And even if they are not ready to change their life yet, something else changes first. They begin to see themselves with gentler eyes. Less judgment, less shame, more understanding. They realize the desire they feared is the same desire that makes them human. And this realization, quiet as a leaf falling in the dark, is the beginning of transformation. The chapter of fear is no longer the only chapter. Another is opening, not loud, not certain, but real. A soft, internal turning toward themselves.